Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and welcome to a special video for today. Today is going to be my first commentary piece, my first official longer form video where I'm going to be commenting about something that I normally wouldn't on my channel, and today it's going to be very video game focused. I am going to be talking about the game The Last of Us Part 2, which I actually ended up playing this year. But before I get into talking about the game, first, a little bit of context. Welcome to the video, The Narrative of The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us is a 2013 narrative game developed by Naughty Dog. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where a mutated strain of fungus takes control of humans and turns them into cannibalistic creatures known as the Infected. They're essentially zombies, but the game never calls them that. In this dystopian landscape, we play as Joel, a man who lost his daughter during the time that the strain was really beginning to take shape. 20 years later, and the loss still affects his every action. He's aggressive, angry, and willing to do whatever it takes to stay alive. As a smuggler, he is eventually tasked to take Ellie, a 14-year-old girl, to a secret location held by the Fireflies, a rebel organization seeking to defeat the corrupt government at the center of this world. Joel and his partner Tess eventually discover that Ellie has been bitten. However, she has had the infection for a long time and has not gotten infected. She's immune. This slightly changes Joel's tune in discovering there could be a way to cure the disease that was ultimately the reason his daughter died. However, things become more complicated as Joel forms a father-daughter-like relationship with Ellie. When the two get to the Firefly hideout, the Fireflies admit there's a possibility Ellie could die in the surgery to find the cure within her. Joel, not wanting to lose the person he'd come to love, chooses to break her out of the surgery, killing a lot of Fireflies in the process, including the surgeon who was working on curing her. Keep this surgeon in mind. He's very important to the second game. Ellie asks Joel what happened, and he lies to her, saying the Fireflies had tried to make cures before, and they had failed before. Ellie accepts the lie, but we can tell that it's implied that this conversation won't be over forever, and that is the game's dark conclusion. Now, I didn't play this game when it released back in 2013. In fact, I didn't play this game until this year with my brother. Some of the footage, in fact most of the footage you're going to see through this video, is of us playing both this game and Part 2. The critic and audience consensus is that the first game is a masterpiece. It was a game changer for narrative games in the 2010s with its high production value and huge focus on deeply developing its two main characters. I can't say that I passionately disagree with people after playing through the game myself. I may not love it to the same degree as some people do. I don't think it's entirely perfect. The gameplay can start getting pretty repetitive, the central plot of finding a cure in a zombie plague feels a little cliched, and sometimes it can feel like the game loses steam in certain places. However, it was the characters that really pushed this game over the edge for me. Joel and Ellie are two of the best characters I've seen in any piece of art to date, and that includes movies and TV shows. I love how the game draws out Joel's character arc, so that it makes sense to the audience why Joel stops the Fireflies from curing Ellie, even if it wasn't the right thing to do. Joel is an anti-hero, but he is one whose actions we can entirely understand and sympathize with in many places. It was really Ellie who was my favorite in the first game, though. I loved getting to see how she was hardened by the world she's lived in for her whole life, but we get to see more vulnerabilities and childlike insecurities of this character as Joel and Ellie begin to bond. The relationship between Joel and Ellie is the anchoring force of The Last of Us, and I think that's why so many people absolutely loved it, and we're looking forward to seeing more of that in Part 2. But what Part 2 had to offer was decidedly not that. Was that for better or for worse? Well, let's talk about it. Before I get into my full discussion of this game, I do want to warn you that there's going to be spoilers throughout this whole video. So if you haven't played Last of Us Part 2 and are wanting to, and don't want to know any spoilers or any major plot points that happen, then I advise you to click off on the video right now, because I'm going to be talking about literally everything. But for the rest of you, here we go. Let's go ahead and talk about Ellie first. The Last of Us Part 2 takes place 5 years after the first game. Joel and Ellie's relationship is strained. However, they have still managed to build a life in Jackson, where Joel's brother Tommy was based at in the first game. We see that Jackson has become a far bigger place, boasting restaurants, stores, and pretty much anything you would expect out of a big city. The structure of it almost makes one forget that the characters are still living in the midst of a zombie apocalypse. Ellie is struggling not just on her relationship with Joel, but also having feelings for Dina, whom she has known since she was a teenager. Eventually, the two do confess their feelings for one another and start dating. Joel and Ellie eventually seem to reconcile in a way when Joel gives Ellie a guitar for her birthday, but it's clear that something is still tense between them. But maybe they'll be able to work it out for now. I've come to really enjoy this part of the game, just getting to see the characters I've come to love in a new game, and seeing how they're coping now. Then, the story suddenly shifts perspectives. It goes to a totally new character named Abby, who is stationed at a lodge with a bunch of other unknown characters. They are apparently looking for someone, and the way she's talking about it puts a pit of dread in my stomach. We actually start playing as Abby, which definitely caught me off guard, but I didn't think too much about it at first. She is suddenly cornered by a lot of infected, but she is rescued by Joel and Tommy, who run into her. When Joel says who he is, a light of recognition goes off for Abby. The pit of dread in my stomach grows deeper. Tommy and Joel follow Abby to where she and her group are, as it's too dangerous to go back to Jackson. As soon as they are there, Joel and Tommy are suddenly captured and beaten, and it's revealed that Abby has a vendetta against Joel. The pit in my stomach grows deeper. Ellie and Dina go out searching for the two men, but the result isn't what they want, as they too are captured by Abby and her followers. And then, the unthinkable happens. We watch Ellie watching Joel get beaten over and over. It's horrifying. It's disgusting. It's infuriating. And then, with one final swing of her club, Abby puts the finishing blow on Joel. And just like that, it's over. 2 hours into the game, and the main character from the first one is gone. Joel is dead. And like Ellie, we are furious. For most people, this will be the part of the game where you're either in or you're out. I knew that Ellie would be the main character of this game. That much was promised in the trailers and promotion. And I even had the feeling that Joel would be dead by the time the game ended. But the game basically upended my expectations in that regard. Joel did die, but definitely not in the way I expected. Both my brother and I, when we saw this, had a pretty raw reaction to it. Here's what I had to say when the game fast forwards to the day after Joel's death.
Why? Not sure if I like that they took him out like that.
Just some random girl that we know nothing about just gets to do that 2 hours into the game. Don't know the reason, don't know, I mean, we obviously
We're gonna find out the reason. She's not with the Fireflies. Some liberation going on.
It's gotta be something deeper than, I don't know what it could have possibly been.
My worry with this, because it's clear what this is now. This is going to be a revenge story. And revenge stories play out almost the exact same every time. Where the theme is, you'll never be satisfied with holding hate in your heart. And it's not going to end up satisfying for you no matter how much you do. I really hope that's not what the main idea of the movie is going to be, but...
Movie?
Yeah, the game.
That's what I had to say at the time, and it came from a place of real anger and sadness. Like many people, I was angry that a character I'd come to love was just gone. Just like that. And because of that, I started assuming things about the game. I assumed the game would play like a cliched revenge story, and that the ultimate message the game would give is that revenge is unfulfilling, and that we shouldn't desire it. I did say in that clip I showed that I was willing to give the game the benefit of the doubt, but my first response was to assume the rest of the game's quality would be bad. Thankfully, my perspective changed. At its core, Ellie's story is not about revenge, at least to me. That is the surface level. That is what we see on screen, her unbridled, raw anger. There's hardly a moment where that isn't her primary emotion. But underneath it all, I think Ellie's story is far deeper and far more powerful than I was at first giving the game credit for. Ellie's story is about her relationship with Joel, and all the deep flaws and insecurities underlying it. This game does a great job showing that in the complex way it tells its story. Many game players have called the story here messy, confusing, and all over the place. After playing the game in its entirety, I mostly disagree. The narrative here is incredibly purposeful in what it does, and the way the game creators subvert our expectations in telling this narrative is awesome to me. Ellie's story not just being about revenge is what makes this revenge story work to me. Through multiple flashbacks, we see the missing pieces of how Ellie's relationship with Joel developed. This game clearly showed how close they were becoming in Ellie's younger years. There's a particularly powerful flashback scene, probably my favorite moment from the game, where Joel takes Ellie to an abandoned and ruined museum for her birthday. The game creators put this scene in at a perfect time in the game, where we were still raw from Joel's loss, but not so much that the scene would feel pandering or disingenuous. Instead, the scene clearly honors Joel's memory, and it's a revealing moment for just how much Joel meant to Ellie. And the game doesn't repeatedly idolize their relationship either, which is so important. We get to see the flaws that both of them had, and why this made Joel's death more bittersweet to Ellie. In a key flashback, it's revealed that Ellie finally confronts Joel about the Firefly incident, and Joel admits he lied. This, of course, is what causes the rift between them. Ellie is angered, rightfully so, that Joel took away from her the possibility of dying in a way that could be redemptive and helpful to everyone. Seeing this from her perspective complicates our feelings even more so on the ending of the first Last of Us, and our justification of Joel doing what he did is put into question. This game forces us to grasp with the morals of Joel doing this, and I love that it does this. Even more so than the first game, the characters are not just one thing. They are complicated, and there's not always an easy answer. That is the case for both Ellie and Joel. And yet, even though the game forces us to grapple with this, that still doesn't make the loss hurt any less for Ellie. In fact, it might make it more painful, because Ellie never quite got to resolve this with Joel, and that made his death more brutal. The fact that the game reveals this so cleverly shows to me that the way the story was built and told was not remotely lazy. There's a lot more I could say about these first 14 hours or so I played with Ellie, because these are definitely the best parts of the game. Playing her and us getting to see her commit some murders that become more and more horrific does not make for fun gameplay, but it is chilling to watch Ellie turn into a more gruesome and violent individual, up to the point where she crosses the line and murders one of Abby's friends that turns out to be pregnant. And like Ellie, we have to grapple with the fact that, though we understand why she's doing this, there are some real ramifications to her actions that make her a not entirely good person. And then, our perspective becomes even more complicated. About halfway into the game, there is another brutal scene that takes place in the theater where Abby, Dina, Jesse, and Tommy are stationed. Abby kills Jesse and points the gun at Ellie, and it seems like we're reaching the climax of the game. But then, the game fades to black. And then we realize that we're playing as Abby now. I have to say, this was a really ballsy move on Naughty Dog's parts. This was not promoted anywhere in the trailers. Having us play as the person who killed Joel, the person who we have hated for the duration of the whole game, I was pretty much in the same boat as Ellie that I wanted Abby to die. What gave her the right to kill Joel? Why did she get to take him out so unceremoniously? Did this game really think that it would be a good idea to play as a person who murdered a character so beloved? Well, there I go again, assuming things about the game, and assuming them wrongly. Now, while I definitely don't enjoy Abby's story quite as much as Ellie's, there's still a lot of interesting things to talk about here. First of all, the game reveals early in Abby's perspective that her father was a surgeon that Joel killed in the first game. Now, this reveal was very effective to me, because we, the player, literally pulled the trigger that killed the surgeon in the first game. And at least to me, killing him felt wrong. He was only defending himself, and I don't think he had any intent of killing Joel. But still, we killed him, and the game didn't treat it as a particularly joyous moment. Having us play as a character who was affected by this death definitely complicates things. Maybe, just maybe, even though Abby murdering Joel was wrong, it was justified? I still cringe saying that because I don't like saying it, but that's the point. We aren't supposed to like that we are understanding someone who, up until this point, has been the antagonist. We aren't supposed to like that maybe, just maybe, to someone else, Joel was more of a bad person than a good one. My feelings on Abby got even more complicated when she encountered two children of the Seraphites, a religious cult in the game. Even though her faction, the WLF, or the Washington Liberation Front, has learned to hate the Seraphites, Abby comes to bond with two of them that are trying to escape the oppressive bonds of the cult. The one we get to know the most is Lev. The cult refers to Lev as Lily, which is something that we at first don't quite understand, but when it's revealed why he calls himself Lev, the reason for him leaving the Seraphites makes a lot more sense. Abby forms a relationship with him that is eerily similar to the relationship that Joel and Ellie have. She treats Lev like a son, determined to protect him no matter what. So now, outside of killing Joel, Abby isn't really that different from Ellie. She has people she cares about, she's in love with someone, and she ultimately wanted revenge against someone who hurt her. But also like Ellie, she's a morally complicated character who does things that are undeniably bad. But now, I as a player can't just simply call her the bad guy. The game developers force you to reckon with this, and when I got into the scene in the theater from Abby's perspective, I didn't root for her to kill Ellie in what is a tense showdown. But I didn't want Ellie to kill Abby either. The fact that the game managed to make me say that is actually pretty incredible. I'm going to keep this part brief, as there isn't a whole lot for me to say about the final parts of this game. In fact, I really just want to cut to the final scenes, in which Ellie once again fights Abby. Even though the first fight in the theater was pretty intense, this one was even more raw in a way. Abby had been beaten and weakened by a group who delighted in using zombies to kill others for sport. Ellie was also in a heavily vulnerable state, as she had barely escaped from the same group. Both of them were basically near death, making the fight all the more breathless. And in the end, just when you think Ellie is going to take her revenge, she doesn't. This is another place where the game, in my opinion, does well in its subversion of expectations. The fact that Ellie still wanted revenge after getting to spend time with Dina and her child made me think that she would obviously kill Abby this time. She traveled to a whole other island just to complete this task. But she doesn't. We see key images going through her head as she thinks of Joel. To me, this isn't Ellie thinking of what Joel would want. This is her letting Joel go, and in that way, forgiving Abby for what she did. The writers show the weight of this action is absolutely crippling to Ellie. While it's important for her to let go, it's hard. The final moments in this game really did make me tear up. We have one last flashback between Ellie and Joel, which is beautifully done. It defines their complicated relationship. And Ellie says in the flashback that she would like to try and forgive Joel for lying to her. And then we see Ellie in the present, leaving the guitar behind, perhaps symbolizing that she is going to still try and find a way to use herself as a cure for the infection. That bittersweet scene ends the game out perfectly. We are left with some tough things to think about. There's no easy answers to the things this game discusses. And that is exactly what makes the game work. I briefly wanted to discuss the technicals and the gameplay of this game, but I really don't have a whole lot to say about it, so I'm going to keep this short. This video was more concerned with talking about the whole story. I don't really think this video warrants me slapping on a rating or anything like that, so I hope that wasn't what you were expecting. Gameplay-wise, this game is pretty enjoyable to me. A problem I had with the first game was I felt its gameplay could get repetitive, and while that is occasionally the case for this game, it's to far less of a degree. I thought the combat was intuitive and fun, and I enjoyed that you got to figure out really creative ways to get around certain enemies. Sometimes just running from enemies was the best option, which was a pretty intriguing choice. I liked that the game had a lot of creative locations for you to fight, using great atmosphere to make the fights feel more interesting and intense. As far as my main critiques, I will say that the game's structure can definitely be a hindrance in certain places. Particularly in the Abby scenes, the flashbacks can become excessive. While the flashbacks did have a purpose, I still think that a couple from both Abby and Ellie's perspectives could have been cut out, and the game would have flowed far better. The human enemies can start to get really overdone and irritating as well. I like that the Seraphites act differently than the WLF, but the amount of times you see both sets of enemies can start becoming overbearing at some point. The zombie enemies were a lot more fun to deal with overall, whereas the human enemies could sometimes just come across as an inconvenient hindrance. Also, I will say the epilogue of the game was a little unnecessary in parts. I liked that we see that even in Ellie's seemingly idealistic life, she was still haunted by Joel's death and still wanted to avenge it. But most of the events on the island, including the new sets of enemies, came across as annoying and more padding out time than anything else. Thankfully, the final fight between Abby and Ellie and the actual ending are both great, but most everything else before that could have been cut out. Even though I doubt this video is going to get a whole lot of attention, which is fine by me, I still think that some people might be expecting me to talk about the controversies that were surrounding this game. I really don't want to delve into most of them, as for the most part they come from a pretty toxic part of the internet I don't want to acknowledge. I will briefly say that I personally just don't get some of the critiques this game has. There are some legitimate ones out there, I'm sure, but a lot of the ones I'm seeing seems to draw down to the fact that people think the game is bad because Joel died, or that the game is bad because it panders to SJWs. Arguments like these aren't particularly good, and ultimately they don't add much of anything to the conversation. I am going to say something that I think people will be angry about. I think The Last of Us Part 2 is better than the first game. While I love the characters in the first game, I really appreciate how this game complicates our perspective on every main character, really challenging the player in ways I haven't seen a whole lot of video games do. The story this game tells is a complex one that is undeniably grim and sometimes hard to watch, but make no mistake, to me, this is a compelling and powerful story. This game is still about Joel and Ellie, even though Joel is technically out of most of the game. The fact that this game still managed to do that, make the story about them, and in a way that is even more emotional, is an impressive achievement. I feel like this game concludes the Last of Us franchise pretty well. There are already rumors of a third game, and even the possibility of a TV show. Wherever this game series goes, I'm very happy with what I got here. The Last of Us Part 2 is a great game, with well-developed characters, a compelling story, and powerful themes. I won't be forgetting it anytime soon, that's for sure. So, what are your thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2? Let me know in the comments down below. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment below letting me know your thoughts, because I did put a lot of work into this video. Once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. And if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please feel free to subscribe to my channel to see future content. And hopefully I'll have more videos like this in the future, because I really enjoyed making this one. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.